this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
When World War II began in 1939, it sparked a deadly conflict between the Axis and the Allies, while also creating tense negotiation amongst allies. Diplomacy, military power and economic decisions determined the fate of nations. In North America, the US and Canada worked to build a military alliance to protect their coasts from German U-boats and the threat of Japanese invasion. Their economies became intertwined to supply weapons for Britain and other allies. And defending North America was crucial before sending forces abroad. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me today is Tim Cook. Tim is the Chief Historian and Director of Research at the Canadian War Museum. He has penned numerous best-selling books which have won multiple prizes, his latest being The Good Allies, How Canada and the United States Fought Together to Defeat Fascism During the Second World War. Thanks for joining me, Tim. So we're going to be looking at the relationship between Canada and the US during World War II, which I think is probably more complex than one might first think. But perhaps we should start by looking at their pre-war partnership. While Canada is a North American nation, at this time it's also a British dominion. So where does this place Canada? Is it in the British sphere of influence or the US? Where does Canada look economically and politically?
It's a great question. It's a bit of a twilight nation, or it's got one foot in, of course, the British Empire as a British dominion, as you say, and one as a North American nation. And it is the Second World War that will really transform it and really make it into a North American nation. But you're right to think, where is it before that? And I think it'd be fair to say before 1939, it is really part of the British Empire, a British dominion, proudly so, has a British culture. The monarchy is really important to Canada. The Great War, like for other dominions, is a key aspect in our evolution into taking on a greater sense of identity and a nationalizing spirit. Of course, we pay for that in blood. Your listeners can think about Vimy Ridge and the important role as a symbol there. And in Canada, because we're, at the start of the war, the Second World War, we're about 11.5 million. The United States is 131 million, and already it's eclipsed Britain as an economic power, not a military power, but an economic power. So we're very wary of the United States, and Canadians at the time, during the war, and still to this day, often define themselves as being not American. So it's a really interesting period. And Angus, you and I, we talked a bit about this before, but, I'm a scholar of the two world wars as these great transformative events, these great mobilizing events for Canada. About 1 in 3 adult males serving in the First World War, about the same for the Second World War. And what really, I guess, why I turned to this new book, The Good Allies, which is my 19th book, is to try to better understand that relationship between the Canada and the US, because I had explored in so many other different books the relationship between Canada and Britain.
Thinking about that pre-war moment, obviously Canada's a North American nation, which looks to Britain, but how does that sit with sort of defence? Because almost any country has agreements with one another. It would seem unusual not to have some form of agreement with your neighbour. And so going into the war, that potentially is or isn't a problem. I'm not sure if either countries ever felt threatened by one another. Obviously, we've got those wars of 1812. Is 1812? Do they just? Is there any sort of military agreement?
It's a great question. And really, I think it goes back to your first question, where Canada is really aligned with Britain. So all of our agreements are with Britain. All of our professional soldiers go through Staff College. The Royal Canadian Navy is deeply aligned with the Royal Navy. So almost all of the officers serve on Royal Navy warships at some point in their career. Our Air Force, which is established in 1924, but during the First World War, some 20,000 Canadians like Billy Bishop and William Barker served with RAF or the British Flying Services. So we are really very much part of that imperial war effort. And to come to your question, it is quite shocking in the late 1930s as war looks to be on the horizon, as Nazi Germany is rearming and threatening neighbors, with Italy at war in Ethiopia, with Japan invading China. Canada has no real military agreement with the United States. In fact, in the 1920s and early 30s, the two countries have defense plans on how to invade each other. I mean, Canada's plan was to across the border, the 49th parallel, to capture a number of unnamed American cities and then to hold on to them and engage in a fighting retreat while it waited for the Royal Navy to sail across the Atlantic and to begin to firebomb cities on the coast. While, get this, Australia was supposed to send an expeditionary force to invade California. So wildly far-fetched because nobody was interested in doing that, and Canada didn't have the military. But the U.S. plan is just as absurd. Its plan is to capture the Pacific coast, so Vancouver and Victoria, the East Coast critical port city of Halifax, which it would douse in chemical weapons. That was the plan, aerial dispersed chemical weapons. It would cut the country in two by capturing Winnipeg, which is around the middle of the country, and then it would march on Ottawa. All of this, of course, with, at the time, only the 19th largest army in the world, the U.S. So both countries, one could argue that professional militaries need to have these plans. But it gives a sense, I think, of, the unease between Canada and the United States. Now, it's not that bad. Nobody was really thinking of invading across the border. But to come back to your question, there really wasn't much defense agreement between the two countries. And I write about in the book one of our key soldiers, Harry Crear, who will later command 1st Canadian Army at the end of the war. He goes to Washington in, I think it's 1937, and he doesn't know anyone, and nobody knows him. And he's all basically knocking on doors, trying to get someone to talk to him because he realizes that we need to have a better understanding of the shared security in North America.
I wonder if anyone had told the Australians they were expected to sail across the Pacific to attack. But am I right in saying it's a demilitarized border, though? They're not. It's a fairly free and open border. But in which case, when Canada goes to war, and it goes to war straight away in defence or goes to war with Britain, does US neutrality cause Canada a problem? Canada's now a belligerent nation with an open border with a neutral country.
You're exactly right. And this is very worrisome to President Roosevelt and the White House. By 1938, there are closer relations, and Roosevelt even says in a historic speech in August of 1938, if Canada is ever invaded, we will come to your aid, which actually sets people in Ottawa at unease as to what he means by that, right? Is he going to invade across to liberate us through invasion? But we are still very early in figuring this out. But when war comes in September of 1939, you're right. Canada stands with Britain, but it chooses to go to war. This is not like the Great War where Canada was automatically at war. We decide in the House of Commons after the Statute of Westminster in 1931, but we stand by Britain. So we go to war on the 10th of September, 1939. And of course, the United States is wondering, well, it's got a nation at war on its northern border, 9,000 kilometers border that is largely open and unprotected on either side. And so in the White House, they're very worried about Canada, where they haven't paid much attention, much more focused on Latin America, much more focused on Hitler and the war in the Pacific. And the Roosevelt administration realizes it needs to wake up to this. So on the sly, because as you say, neutrality laws and such things, it begins to send some weapons to Canada, old tanks and things like that. Maybe more importantly, it sends machinery, expertise. Already there is a car manufacturing industry, the big companies, GM and Ford, that are cross-national or transnational, and they very quickly begin to help Canada mobilize its wartime industry, which starts very small because of the Depression years and because Britain is not buying a lot from Canada initially. But really, with the fall of France and the retreat from the continent in May and June of 1940, that's a cataclysm, right? That changes everything. And everyone is wondering what will happen. How will Britain survive? And one of the things I argue is that something that Canadian historians don't pay a lot of attention to, but neither do the British historians or American historians, is the incredible contribution of Canada to Britain during the course of the war. We are an industrial powerhouse. There is the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan that trains up 131,000 airmen, and we could talk more about this. We send our best destroyers to help defend Britain. We send our best RCAF squadrons. We send a division and then a second division after the fall of France, and eventually 500,000 Canadians will serve or be stationed in Britain. This is an incredible contribution, but it couldn't be done unless we had a secure North America. And that's not something we often think about. We wouldn't have been sending the 16,000 aircraft that we manufacture in Canada to Britain if we were under threat. We wouldn't have sent the 850,000 trucks if we were under threat. So how you defend North America, the East Coast, the West Coast, the North, is a critical step. And it's something that historians have largely overlooked.
But it's that even down to if you have a neutral nation next to a belligerent nation, what's to stop Germans sending spies to neutral America and sending them across an open border? It must be a huge security. And you think of all, being British, I think of all the loose lips sink ships. It must have been even more prescient in Canada because there is a border that can walk across. At least in Britain, we have to fly them, and there's an idea it's hard to get into the country. In Canada, presumably, they can just walk in from the US.
Yeah, there are all kinds of rumors and stories of American Germans who will come across the border. And, to go back to your original question of the sort of bad neighbors, well, during the American Civil War, so 1861 to 65, there are all kinds of cross-border raids from Canada into the U.S. and the U.S. into Canada. There's a group called the Fenians, of course. They were Irish Americans who they had a fanciful plan to invade Canada, which they did in 1866, to capture Canada, ransom it back to Britain, to then free Ireland, right? It was about as ludicrous as it sounds just saying that out loud. But there were and have been all kinds of raids and wars, including the War of 1812 and other acts of aggression in the 19th century. So it's not beyond the realm of the possible for Canadians to worry about the roughly 8 million German Americans and what they might do during this war. Now, the United States does not want its citizens to be invading another country and so actively blocking that. But there's tremendous fear. And if you look at some of the Hollywood films from that time, there are lots of spy stories. We have all those posters that are everywhere. And there is this heightened sense of threat everywhere. Now, that probably works in favor of Canada to mobilize that war effort. You need to feel threatened. We are protected by the Atlantic and the Pacific until the U-boats cross in 1941. So, that's a part of this story. And I'm a military historian for the most part and a political historian, but this is a book where I look at the diplomatic relations between Canada and the U.S. We send some of our best people to Washington to try to, at first, calm the Americans and then to work with them and then to elbow our way, in Washington with everyone else who's there. The trade is really fascinating, and the economy of war and the mobilization of war resources. And one of the things I argue in the book is that it's one of the few times in our shared history with the Americans where they really need Canada. They need Canada to help figure out how they're going to defend North America, which we do in 1940. We have all these defense agreements that begin to come together, the mechanisms and the machinery to work that out. but they need Canadian resources. And that may be one of our greatest contributions during the war. We pull out something like 3 billion tons of nickel, about that amount, 3 billion tons of aluminum, which are being sent both to Britain and to the United States to help the war industry, which is so critical since we start from so far behind with the fascist countries. I've written many books on the Canadian fighting experience, and I don't really want to say this out loud, but it may be that Canada's contribution is less about the 5 infantry divisions and armored divisions that we had, and it might be more about 3 billion tons of aluminum. Now, I think it is both, but we often forget about, in Canada, let's say, those natural resources, of which we're a big country, and even to this day, we are a natural resource exporter, which are so important when we think of the total war aspect of the Second World War.
I find the economics of it all, the triumvirate of countries, the economics of it all absolutely fascinating. You've already sort of touched upon that symbiotic relationship of Canadian and American industry, which instantly got me thinking about sort of Detroit and Windsor, the automotive industry, which kind of opposite side of the river, but sort of working at one. But I wondered then, as Canadian industry is ramping up and it is pumping out tremendous amounts of material to send to Britain and equip itself, do the Americans then not just undercut the Canadians with Lend-Lease to almost as a protectionist measure, which blocks Canada out?
Yeah, that hurts us just as much as it helps Britain, right? So Lend-Lease listeners will remember Britain is basically out of money. It's burned through the treasury. The Americans are extracting that, and we shouldn't think of them as the good friends. They were bleeding Britain white of its securities and treasury. But Britain needs that, especially after the fall of France and being able to extract its army from Dunkirk, but leaving behind almost all of its modern weapons there. So Canada plays a key role in helping to supply Britain, but it needs Lend-Lease. And when Roosevelt decides to do that in late 40, early 41, that's critical to the war effort, as we know. But it has the potential to completely cut the Canadians off at the knees. Because if nobody has to pay for Canadian war supplies anymore, we're not going to be able to build anything. And our Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, is a critical figure in this history. And I have to tell you, Mackenzie King is not the most likable of leaders. He's not terribly charismatic. He certainly pales in comparison to Roosevelt and Churchill. He was exceedingly cautious. He was a leader from the ranks and the rear. But he's our longest serving Prime Minister in Canada. And he's a really interesting figure. For many years, he was a bit of a joke because he believed in the spiritual side. He believed in seances. He spoke and took advice from dead politicians and his mother, even his dog, who'd all passed beyond the great beyond. He saw signs on clock faces and others. He was spiritual, but he's also a very lonely man. And there's a human element to Mackenzie King. I think that is really fascinating. But he plays a key role by going south to Washington, forging a friendship with Roosevelt, impressing on Roosevelt the importance of having a strong Canadian neighbor in matters of security on the East Coast and the West Coast, but also wartime industry. And Roosevelt, to his credit, understands this, even though there are some in the White House who want to squeeze the Canadians as they are squeezing the British. And so we don't take Lend-Lease. We have a different financial deal with the Americans, which is in effect that the Americans will basically buy as much from us as we buy from them to help balance off dollar payments and things like that. Now, it's kind of technical history, but I try to present it in the book. But the key takeaway here is that the Americans, while we are good allies to the Americans, as I make clear in the book, they are good allies to us, to Canada, especially so. And why is that? It is because the Americans need the Canadians. And there are not many times in our history where the Americans need us, but they need us to help secure the borders and the East Coast and the West Coast. They need a strong Canada in case of the doomsday scenario where the Nazis were to cross the Atlantic. They need us after Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and throughout the Pacific. And Canada, at that point, if we think of December of 41, when Japan attacks and then Hitler declares war in the United States, the Americans are down and they need allies. And so that's the period of where Britain and the United States really come together. But so does Canada. We step up and we help the Americans on the East Coast when the U-boats are ravaging American merchant ships, almost out of pure incompetence on the part of the Americans who don't have convoys and let their ships sail, with no protection. It's the Royal Canadian Navy that helps the Americans, in those critical months in early 1942. We help on the West Coast when there is such, fear that there will be a Japanese invasion. We send 4 squadrons to Alaska to help protect there. We do everything that is asked and more. And I argue that that's the good allyship that goes both ways. And it's not out of altruism, although maybe that's a part of it, but it's out of this understanding, both in Canada and the United States, that we need to have a good alliance here to secure North America. So then we can send those expeditionary forces abroad to fight in Italy, or Northwest Europe or places like that.
Tim, we're going to pause it there. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm talking to Tim Cook about Canada in the Second World War. What I'm intrigued by is how much is it that's King? It is King steering the politics. I find King fascinating because he's been around a long time. He's known FDR for years. Whilst he's met Churchill, he doesn't quite have the same relationship. But how much is it that's King that's sort of steering this independent course? Is it? And you sort of, as you say, he's not necessarily a well-known figure outside of Canada, but it strikes me he's perhaps a much bigger figure than you might think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to be fair, Canadians don't often feature in many discussions of World War II, the big books. We need to do a better job in Canada in writing our own history and in presenting our stories. And I've always said it's not up to British historians or American historians to tell the Canadian story. We need to do that so that they can understand maybe the more totality of the Allied war effort in this case. But Mackenzie King, or King, does play a critical role in advocating for Britain in those dark days of May and June of 1940. Roosevelt is very Machiavellian. Nobody thinks, of course, Britain will survive. And he leans on King to say, hey, can you reach out to Churchill and others? And if Britain is invaded and occupied, they should not let the Royal Navy fall into the hands of Hitler. They should sail that to the New World. And we could continue the fight from Canada. Well, King and Churchill and others all see that as transparent, self-serving Americans who just don't want the Navy to fall into German hands. As Churchill says, as opposed to predicting our doom, how about sending us hundreds of aircraft to help defend, right? And so King is very much advocating for the British Empire, of which he's a Victorian from the late 19th century, born and raised. He loves the British Empire, even though he's a Canadian nationalist in that sense. But he understands that to support Britain, he has to lean into the United States. That's the relationship. And he's a cautious politician, as I've mentioned. He doesn't really want to be in the middle of this triangle, but he finds that's where Canada is. So he does play, I think, an important role in 1940 and 41, largely, I think, in helping Canada come up to a proper war footing, which will then allow it to support Britain. But by early 42, when the U.S. is facing a two-front war, and Britain understands that it has to have that tight relationship with the United States, and we see all of the defense mechanisms and machinery come into place, and Roosevelt and Churchill with their special relationship and others, Canada gets elbowed off. And King he understands that. He understands that he can't stand with the big two. And especially when Stalin is now our part of this very strange alliance. But he's still there, and he still finds, I suppose, opportunities where Canada can play a role and where we can benefit from being a good ally. And so, to answer your question, I think King is a really important figure, and more so in this book, when you look at, as what I've tried to do, look at that north-south relationship, so over the border, Canada-US, as opposed to the east-west of Canada-Britain, right? That's the one where we often think of the Canadian relationship. And so it's interesting, of course, when you take a topic and you just change it a little bit, or, change the prism a bit, you see a different light coming through. And I would say in the terms of this light, King comes off very well. He comes off well trying to balance issues of sovereignty with the U.S. We're always afraid that the Americans are going to overpower us. One of the stories I talk about in the book is the opening up of the Canadian North and the building of the Alaska Highway, which the Americans have wanted to connect their southern states to Alaska. Canada is very nervous about this because on a map, it looks like the U.S. is building a road right through our country, which they are, which will divide the country. And yet we allow this to happen with fear over sovereignty issues. And then at the end of the war, we demand to pay for it, which the Americans find kind of funny. Oh, the Canadians want to spend $100 million. Okay, whatever. But we do that because we're always balancing sovereignty issues with the U.S. and with Britain as well. And I think King does very well there, because we should remember that this is all new for Canada. We've spent the last 100 years or so, 50 years, trying to balance sovereignty with Britain, right? Ottawa and London, and how much to give and take. It's quite new to think, how are we going to work with Washington? And this is the war that propels us forward to forcibly think about those issues and to both figure out how you lean in on issues of security or sovereignty, but what barriers you're going to have as well, so you don't become basically a colony of the United States.
Yeah, and I can't help but sort of feel that sort of King manages to promote that sense of Canadianness that pushes away from a sense of Britishness. But I wondered if the war also helped to create more of a Canadian identity that's separate from that sort of, which was referred to when I was at university as US cultural imperialism. Does the war create a sense of Canadianness that's unique from a Britishness? Or certainly an Americanness, which presumably it creeps across the border?
Yeah, it definitely propels Canada forward there, as did the last war, the First World War. These two world wars, I argue, are absolutely crucial in helping Canadians forge a new sense of identity, still proudly part of the British Empire in the First World War, but separate from, with its own heroes, its own military heroes, its own cultural heroes. I did a book called The Secret History of Soldiers, which was great fun, looking at the cultural output of soldiers, song and theater and comics and slang and ghost stories and all this kind of stuff, which ultimately helped to forge a separate sense of Canadian identity. During the Second World War, we are, 20 years advanced from there, but it's a continual process, right? We are still trying to figure out who we are, as you said off the top, as part of the British Empire, but also as North Americans. And so we see that our film industry developed significantly during the war. Our radio, our CBC, which is based on the BBC, becomes an important nationalizing element. And wars do that, right? There are all kinds of unintended consequences in war. Legacies. No one goes to war in 1939 to have a stronger National Film Board or a stronger CBC, right? But those are some of the things that emerge out of it. No one went to war in 1939 to have this integrated US-Canada economy by the end of the war. And yet that is a legacy. And so I think that's always one of the fascinating things for me as a historian, to think about the way that war is an agent of change. And certainly, you've nailed it. The war for Canada, I think, really forces us to grow up and to think of how we will stand on our own, how we will negotiate difficult relationships in a time of great crisis. I mean, this is a war that has to be won, and Canadians are all in on this. It will be the cataclysmic if Britain falls and is overrun in 1940. Everyone realizes that. King says, if Britain falls, we will basically become an American state. There's no way we can stand on our own. So there are lots of reasons why Canada and the US become tighter together. But one of those key ones is that so we can fight effectively overseas. And, we just briefly touched on the Air Force, right? Training up 131,000 airmen. We create this huge bomber force, a sixth group, which has 14 squadrons, which I think, is sort of where you are now, where sixth group is stationed.
In Yorkshire.
Yorkshire, yeah. And so that's a fascinating history there. 250,000 Canadians in the RCAF involved in everything. The bombing campaign primarily, but fighters, coastal command, fighting in multiple fronts, Sicily, Italy, Northwest Europe. The Navy, as we've sort of touched on, key role about the Atlantic, which is often forgotten, I think.
Which had a Canadian admiral in charge of American ships. Did I get that?
Yeah. It's a small, almost a footnote, but sort of in the defense of North America. That's part of it. Leonard Murray. And so all of this, I think, just think of the amphibious landings, all right, in Sicily. Right, July of 1943, 3 Americans, 3 British, 1 Canadian. Think of the invasion of mainland Italy, right? Americans and British and Canadians together. Think of D-Day, right? 2 British, 2 American, and then a third supporting, 1 Canadian at Juno Beach. That alone gives you a bit of a sense of Canada as a martial power. I think, maybe to go back to one of your earlier questions, right? We don't often think of Canada in that sense, but I hope this book helps to reframe this a little bit, because the book, several chapters on fighting forces abroad, including First Special Service Force, which is a neat one. Some of your listeners will remember the Devil's Brigade movie from 1968, the Canadian and the Americans in the same unit. I talk about them in one of the chapters, and they're really a symbol for that kind of unified North American war effort. But Canada really, I think it's fair to say, steps up, is an important contributor. And there's a fascinating quote I found from Churchill. It's in one of the conferences, and there's talk of inviting France to be there, de Gaulle. Now, of course, Churchill hated de Gaulle and Roosevelt hated de Gaulle, so it probably wasn't going to happen. But Churchill says something like, why would we invite France? We should be inviting Canada. It's Canada that is really the third major ally to the United States and Britain, if we think of the Soviet Union fighting its own war. And he's not wrong, I think. Now, I should note, too, Canada was not invited, but it is not easy for a young, fairly small country to elbow its way up there with the big two. But Canada continually contributed during the course of the war.
This is why I find King fascinating, because he's constantly there and never quite gets invited. He's at and around sort of the FDR, and then he doesn't get invited to the actual talks. And it's an odd situation for Canada to find itself as a sort of a recognition with King that the leaders he needs to be there, but we're not letting you in the room, which is a bit peculiar.
Yeah, and historians have argued, should King have been more forceful? Would a de Gaulle-like figure, anxious to bite every hand that fed him, done better for Canada? And maybe, but that wasn't our leader. And King does do quite a bit to get Canada sometimes in the room, sometimes outside the room, sometimes hosting things like the Quebec Conference in 1943, a key event where we're not in the room, but we're hosting And there are benefits there. And so, again, it comes back to Canada being a bit of a twilight nation, sort of unsure of itself, changing, not ever. And I'm not advocating that we deserve to be there as we're not. We're an important ally, but a junior one. And yet consequential is a word I use, a consequential nation as part of this necessary alliance to defeat the powerful fascist nations.
What I find interesting is you see Canada is a junior nation. It actually comes out of the war remarkably well. It's not bankrupt. It's done financially very well. It's secure. It doesn't take any martial aid. The legacy of the war for Canada is quite remarkable. I never really considered how it suddenly is one of the richest nations in the world.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And the war and its many legacies, I think, is a really interesting area to explore. But, putting aside the 45,000 Canadians killed in the war, a terrible loss, 55,000 wounded, you're right. Canada emerges as a very wealthy nation, partially because Europe is and the world is in ruins, largely because we're connected to the United States and that we are secure in North America. But it allows us, for the first time in our history, to begin to loan money and to continue that industrialization which occurs. Canada loans, I think it's $3 billion to Britain to help rebuild after the war. And per capita, it's more than what the United States will loan. And that is acknowledged both in London and Washington. We turn outwards. We're a very parochial country before that. And so we're a key member of NATO. We will fight in the Korean War. We will work with the Americans in the defense of North America on the coast, but through NORAD in 1957 and onwards. So there are a lot of change elements, the cultural side, a creation of a new sense of identity. 1 million veterans coming back to this country to help build it up, and a very forward-thinking series of programs to reintegrate them, to send them to university. And so ultimately, this is a hinge point in our history, and Canada emerges as a very different country, and one that will play a far more prominent role in the early Cold War and perhaps the mid-Cold War than many other countries around the world.
Self-confidence. Now, I only really have one other question. So the title is a good ally. So that implies that there are bad allies.
It's a great question. Well, I would say, as we talked about before, we were bad neighbors with the U.S. up to at least the throughout the 19th century. And the early 20th century, we begin to see this good alliance forming. Yeah, I had thought at one point of calling it Bad Neighbors to Good Allies or something like that. It's a bit too wordy. There's a book that came out in early September, and I was keenly aware that there's a major election happening in the U.S. of tremendous vitriol and anger, and I know from past histories, a scholar of political history, that elections are dangerous times because people will say things. And I wanted this book to come out. It's a firmly historical book. I'm not a political scientist. I'm a historian. I'm more comfortable looking backwards than forwards. But there's a lot in this book that resonates today, and resonates with how I think Canada must continue to work with the United States in matters of trade and the economy, and especially security. It's a story, I think, that resonates in how Ottawa and Washington and London perhaps work together. And it is a reminder, to come back to your question, that we were good allies during the war. We were good allies after the war, and we remain good allies to the United States to this day. And I hope that a few American readers might want to pick this up at some point and have a look at this shared history.
Very good. I always tend to think Canada's contribution to the Second World War is overlooked. Thank you. Loyal listener, Tim's book is The Good Allies: How Canada and the United States Fought Together to Defeat Fascism During the Second World War. It is well worth a read. Now, don't forget, if you do enjoy the podcast, you can sign up to be a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. It is a big thank you to patrons whose small monthly contribution allows me, as an independent historian, to put the show together. Patrons have access to a custom RSS feed, which, when used, will allow you to listen to the podcast advert-free. So if you would like to become a patron, that is patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that is all for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.